did start filming reels pieces to camera today. And I've
Mhm.
actually done that weirdly. I mean, because we have actually spent like almost the last 2 years soliciting pieces of camera from people, like
Yeah.
hundreds of people. So it's very ironic that I have not done one before. But I think it's important for me to just do that honestly, because otherwise, how are we going to show all these different sides of ourselves? I mean, I found that a challenge. So I thought, like, okay, I'll start with a reel stating that I'm going to be doing these, like my intention for the year. That's going to be a side of myself that I haven't really shown. But also, I think that because I have another YouTube channel, Empire Watch,
Mhm.
and a podcast with journalist and co-founder of No Cold War, Fiona Edwards. And that is a geopolitical podcast. So it's very serious. It is very serious because it's a very serious topic. And my challenge always is how do we actually translate very serious topics for people? I mean, it affects everyone's daily lives, really, geopolitics, without a lot of people understanding that. A lot of people think it's not connected. They might be interested in domestic politics, and then they might not get that there's a correlation with foreign policy and domestic. They might not get the correlation. So I'm always
Mhm.
interested in like, how do we make it more palatable? How do we make it more accessible? But that channel, Empire Watch, is not necessarily appropriate, I think, to bring maybe my more goofier side to things
Mhm.
or my certain brand of humor to it.
Mhm.
So that's going to be a challenge for me. Can I actually get a tone that
Yeah.
is understandable for people, or is it just going to be really annoying? To be fair, I think you're inevitably going to be annoying to someone. Like, there's no way I'm not you, the universal you, not you specifically, Samantha. But yeah, like just in general, we are always going to be annoying or trigger somebody generally.
Yeah.
Like, cannot possibly be likable to everyone or even likable. I don't know. Speaking
Mhm.
for myself. So that shouldn't be the thing, but I think just like bringing my own perspective to things, that's what I'm going to try. So I'm going to try this year.
Mhm. Can I quickly be cheeky and ask you something about your story? Have you always been interested in geopolitics, or did something trigger you? Because you haven't quite touched upon where you started, like where your career started. But like, was there a moment in time, or was that always a sort of underlying passion that you didn't quite sort of delve into until later life?
That's a really great question because both things are true. On one hand, I was born in London, and then when I was 9, I came back to Malaysia. Well, I didn't come back, but we moved to Malaysia, right? Like when I was 9. My dad's from Malaysia, my mom's from the Philippines. First of all, huge culture shock at 9.
Yeah.
And then secondly, when we view the UK, I mean the UK, the British Empire, you know, that term, the sun doesn't set on the British Empire. That was true at some point. Now it's no longer true. The sun does its setting on the British Empire. That means that there's such a long shadow of the British Empire and colonialism across the world. And now it's imperialism and US imperialism. But you really
Yeah.
feel it in so many ways that a lot of people, I think, who aren't aware of colonialism or imperialism might not realize why they have certain assumptions about things. You know, they
Mm.
might, and that's something that I'm really interested in exploring because
Mhm.
it's like when you come here from that at the age of 9, there's so many lies that we're told, propaganda from the West about their superiority, you know, white supremacy, but colonialism is white supremacy to the nth degree. Like imperialism, racism, it's all part and parcel, you know, it's a tool of imperialism. And so the effects of that, I felt it even at 9. The way that people would respond to my accent just made me very uncomfortable. And, you know, it was a very difficult. I mean, I'm very privileged, okay? I'm not saying it was like extremely traumatizing or anything, but it was a difficult transition for me to make as a child, you know? So
Mhm.
it sort of informed my idea of what the truth is. I didn't understand propaganda at that time, but what the narratives that we were being told, I was already sort of faced with that sort of like
Yeah.
dynamic. And it does bug me because, like I said, I was saying white supremacy and just the superiority complex of the West. It's in everything. You feel like you're being gaslit. And so that
Yeah.
feeling, definitely, I was having that feeling for a really long time. And then when I was still living in LA, Black Lives Matter in March of 2020 during COVID. It was a time when suddenly all these people, a lot of my friends who are very like artistic, creative, vulnerable, beautiful souls in acting and creative artists, but suddenly a lot of them were saying things like, I've never had conversations about racism, never had conversations that were like, we have to have conversations that are uncomfortable, da da da. And there were all these like, in response to Black Lives Matter, these like groups where people were talking about racism, da da da. And for me, I was just like really struck with like confusion because I was like, wow, I've been thinking about racism, talking about racism for a really long time, probably since
Yeah.
nine, probably before that. And that was when I was like, I don't think this is going deep enough because it's not talking about imperialism. It's not talking about colonialism. Like you could say in the US, like white supremacy, just in the US, thinking of like black, white, that's it. Like, within the
Mm.
US, but you're not thinking about how does the US subjugate other parts of the world? Like that wasn't in that conversation. And so I was like, okay, I want to have these conversations. Let me start a podcast. And I started a podcast with one of my friends actually suggested it. She was like, why don't you start a podcast where you're just talking about these concepts? And I was like, no, that is horrible. So ironically, I was like, she's like, why don't you do pieces of camera? And I'm like, no, that's terrible. I would never do that ever. So I came up with this idea of interviewing people that knew more than me. And so I
Mm.
started this podcast called The Ignoramus Guide. And that is actually where I met Fiona Edwards, the journalist and co-founder of No Cold War. I interviewed her on my fourth ever episode of The Ignoramus Guide. Well, we got along there. And then basically fast forward to me moving back to London because
Mm.
of COVID. And we suddenly thought, well, we could actually co-host a podcast together, co-host a
Mhm.
podcast together about geopolitics, because we're both anti-war and anti-imperialist.